In the second year of the Great War, the commander of the French army, General Joseph Joffre, plans a battle in northern France. His aim is twofold and simple: to kill a large number of Germans and to get France's allies, the British, to commit its new army to an offensive on the Western Front. The British had begun the war with an army that was small by European standards. By 1916, it numbered more than 1 million men. The size of this army belies its raw and undertrained nature. Most of Britain's experienced soldiers have been killed or wounded in the first 2 years of the war, leaving a small pool of men to train the new mass army. Joffre's plan for an offensive is preempted by the Germans, who launch a savage battle of attrition at Verdun. The French army suffers horrific losses and is forced to use its reserves to stem the onslaught. It will now be Sir Douglas Haig's army that takes the major role on the Somme. The Germans have had 2 years to fortify the chalk ridges. Their defences are of a scale and strength unheard of in field fortifications. Concrete and steel shield their troops from attack. Haig hopes to give his men at least 2 more months to prepare for the Somme. But Joffre states bluntly that France's army, being pulverised by massed German artillery at Verdun, will cease to exist by late August, when Haig feels his army will be ready.
Haig never wanted an offensive in the Somme. There was no British interest down in the Somme. The British interest is up in Flanders, where Belgium, which is a British client state, sits on the Rhine and the Scheldt Delta. And this is a plank of British foreign policy that goes back at least as far as Henry VIII. That's where the British interest was. He's forced into an offensive on the Somme because Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, the senior partner, decides to have an offensive there, and indeed there is some evidence to show that Joffre decided on the Somme as the area to force the British to take part. That said, Joffre wanted a battle of attrition. He wanted to wear the Germans down. He simply wanted to kill Germans. If he killed more Germans than they killed of us, then we win. This is not the British way of waging war, and it's not what Haig wanted. Haig wanted a much cleaner, more clinical breakthrough battle. Sadly, that wasn't to happen, and it wasn't to happen because he is the junior partner. At the end of the day, he's got to dance to the tune played by the French.
For 7 days, British and French artillery pound the German front. Convinced that nothing could survive the barrage, on the 1st of July, the Allies advance in broad daylight.
The French, in particular, insisted on attacking in daylight. In fact, they wanted to attack slightly later in the day, and the 7:30 attack was a compromise between the British and the French. Now, the British generals would certainly have preferred to have attacked at dawn, when the light was poor, and when their riflemen and machine gunners would have found it difficult to find targets. Nevertheless, they went along with the French view, partly because the French had a major contribution on the south, and partly because there was an expectation that the bombardment, which at that point of the war was a particularly heavy bombardment, would have destroyed most of the German frontline defences.
1/3 of the British shells are duds. Lloyd George, as Minister of Munitions, has stopped all quality control to maximise the output of the fledgling British arms industry. A large proportion of the shells that do work are shrapnel, useless against bunkers.
In some areas, the British artillery is destroying the German forward positions and creating breaches in their obstacle belt, in their wire. The trouble is that at night, the Germans are coming out and repairing the breaches in the wire.
When the bombardment finishes, the Germans think what they must be like. They'd had that noise, the ground shaking, they'd had friends killed, they'd not had their rations brought up. They were really shaken. But that's the point. They were shaken, they weren't dead or out of action. And they may not have been happy, they may have been trembling inside, but they could come out of their dugouts, come up the steps into the daylight, bringing their machine guns with them, and then get set to killing the British troops walking towards them.
When their frontline troops ask for help, they're asking for help on specific points that they've already registered in, and they just bring down a curtain of fire when it's required. And our chaps are out in the open, so it's murderous fire. It's not as our fire was to the Germans, where they're in deep dugouts protected. It's a devastating and withering counter-barrage.
At some points, the attackers try to gain an advantage by moving into no man's land.
3 o'clock in the morning, or 3:30, on the 1st of July, 2 companies, about 400 men of the Lancashire Fusiliers, slipped across that field, under cover of a very shallow tunnel, into the sunken lane behind me. At 7:30 in the morning, they assaulted across the field behind me, while the rest of their battalion and those of every other battalion in the division started moving across the field. You can see the cemetery behind me, Beaumont Hamel Military Cemetery. That's about where the German barbed wire was, and that's about as far as any of our men got. You can see a very slight dip where the cemetery is. That's the Rembly, down which the soldiers had to struggle into the German wire, which we hadn't seen and didn't really fully appreciate the density of and the fact it was uncut.
Most barbed wire entanglements are very, very short. They're very low to the ground, but they're built in such a way they're like a cat's cradle. So as you advance to them, you have to try and step over and pick your way through them, which is very, very difficult. And what that does, it slows you right down, just as the point you're right underneath the German rifles.
All along the front, the advancing infantry stumble into this maze. At Beaumont Hamel and other points along the line, the British spend months tunnelling under German strongpoints. Tons of explosive are placed under these fortifications. The timing of the detonation of these mines is critical. At Beaumont Hamel, it is blown 10 minutes early.
The Hawthorne mine was blown 10 minutes before the assault, just as the troops were leaving their trenches to move forward. It immediately alerted the Germans on this part of the front that an attack was probably imminent. Same time, the heavy artillery lifted. Germans came out of their dugouts and they caught the assaulting British battalions as they were still moving up into what was to have been their assault positions.
Field of fire again, unbroken. No cover for anyone. The German machine gunners had a field day.
Now, contrary to the picture beloved by the Hollywood director, the machine gun is not something that's a couple of 100 yards away with the operator using it as a hosepipe. The range of a machine gun, British or German, is 2,500 metres, give or take a yard or two. So the guns can be a long way away. A lot of the men being killed by them don't see where the gun is, and in fact, if the gunner is properly camouflaged and properly dug in, he won't see him. The idea is to have guns with interlocking arcs, creating a belt of fire through which no one can pass without being hit.
1 mile to the south, the Ulstermen of the 36th Division break through the German defences.
The Ulster Division attacked here. They didn't walk across like they did on both sides of them. They walked across on both sides and they were slaughtered. They attacked here and they got to the third line, the third German line, not exactly from this position that we're standing in here, but from further down. They got to the German third line by about 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
The Ulster Division are greatly aided by the fact that they're advancing into dead ground. The Germans can't see them, they can't track their progress as well as they can in other areas up and down their line. And the Ulstermen really use that advantage. They punch forward and break through the German lines, breaking through it right into the position and right up onto Schwaben Redoubt. Now, that's a fantastic achievement.
Breakthrough couldn't be sustained because with the attack failing on both sides, they got caught in crossfire from the German battalions on both sides who had no longer any targets. So they picked the Ulster Division as they were coming out of the wood, and the next waves coming out of the wood were unable to get across no man's land. They were shelled by their own artillery and then they were shelled by the German artillery. The Germans saw them coming and they shelled them from a place called Battery Valley out over the back. And they were shelled by their own artillery because they were ahead of their own artillery barrage.
I actually did a study for the Ministry of Defence some years ago into this subject of what's called friendly fire, blue on blue. And the general conclusion was that in high-intensity battle, First World War, Second World War, the losses from your own weapons are between 20 and 30%.
At La Boisselle, 2 brigades of Tyneside Pals go over the top. 3 mines are blown to clear the way.
As the whistles blew, these very keen soldiers went over the top in extended line and then just walked towards German machine guns.
What this is, this crater, which is the largest crater made by man in anger, was used to begin the Battle of the Somme. So what had happened is when they realised the fortresses, the villages around here were so fortified, they elected to tunnel under the German trench. And why LOCHNAGAR is so special and why it's so large is that they packed it with explosive, 60,000 pounds of explosive, 27 tons. They over-tamped it so that the spoil would not come back on it, and in fact caused a giant mountain around it, which they hoped would provide protection for the troops who were coming over. There was a young airman flying above it, Cecil Lewis, who in his book Sagittarius Rising describes how 4,000 feet up, huge chunks of chalk, the power and the force of this explosion. It flew past his small biplane, he was the official observer, and nearly killed him. The chalk rained down onto the front line of the British troops and injured quite a few of those. Rumour has it it was heard in London, such was the force of the explosion.
The men who fought at La Boisselle are the volunteers of 1914. It is their first battle.
Kitchener's army, this was the new army, these were the service battalions, these were the POWs battalions, these were the chaps who'd come from the same factory, the same sweet shops, the same villages. They'd all joined together, they'd trained together, they'd spent the last 2 years becoming soldiers together.
You've got to remember these were amateur soldiers. They had not had the training that you might expect. They could advance in simple lines, and that really was about it. They hadn't been exposed to fire, it was all new to them. And you need battle experience before you become a really good soldier, certainly to attack. And they just didn't have it. They were weighed down too. Mind you, there's a lot of rubbish talked about that. When you think of what they carried, you know, their pack, their rifle, their bayonet, a bag of bombs, a pickaxe, perhaps a shovel, extra ammunition bandoliers. When you think about it, what would you leave behind? When you get over no man's land, if you get over no man's land, what exactly do you not want? Do you not want your rifle? do you not want your extra bandoliers of ammunition? Well, what about the German counterattacks? What about the bombs? That's for your bombers to use, the hand grenades. If you don't have them, you're going to be dead pretty soon. You have to carry that amount of equipment across no man's land because you're going to need it. And armies today go into battle with roughly the same amount of equipment. After all these years, it hasn't moved on. They still carry well over 60 pounds of equipment.
At the northern end of the front, more PALs advance into the hail of fire.
This is the frontline trench just before Serre, and from here, from these copses, the men of the 31st Division, all the PALs battalions from the north of England, from Barnsley, Sheffield, from Accrington and other places, attempted to take the heavily fortified village of Serre. They advanced from here at 7:30 into a maelstrom of machine gun fire. A very few of them from the Accrington PALs managed to get into the village of Serre, but most of them died, cut down in rows like a scythe taking out the corn. And this field, which is now dotted with cemeteries, was covered with the bodies of the PALs battalions. They said that these battalions were 2 years in the making and 10 minutes in the destruction.
Once the advance had begun, the fate of many units was unknown. The Newfoundland Regiment moves from the reserve to exploit a breakthrough that does not exist. The phone cables that connect the British commanders are cut by a massive German counter-bombardment. Runners carry messages through the storm. Few get through.
The troops are wearing on their backpacks triangles cut from biscuit tins. And it was recognised that communication would be broken within the first minutes of the battle. So we were going to now rely upon the sun reflecting on these triangles that hopefully will be picked up by Royal Flying Corps aircraft. There was absolutely no way of getting a message back across that battlefield in anything other than hours rather than seconds as we can do it today.
Quite beyond our conception is the horror of battle at this stage. Blood, mayhem, communication trenches full of dead and dying, complete disorder and chaos. The Newfoundlanders take advantage of the ground they are in and advance across the open because, relatively speaking, it is dead ground. The Germans do not have a direct view of them until they break the cover of the dead ground and are silhouetted on the skyline here. Because of the intensity of fire, and because at that stage they are the only battalion moving on this part of the battlefield, all the German machine guns that can bear on them would bear on them, as well, of course, as German artillery. Meanwhile, to their right, the 1st Essex Regiment were not able to attack at the same time because they had to come through the communication trenches because their line is under fire from Thiepval Ridge, about 2,000 metres off to the south. And in fact, once the Newfoundland attack has more or less ceased, within a few minutes of its start at 9:30, the last men fighting on this battlefield were members of the 1st Essex Regiment. By this stage, the divisional commander is trying to stop the proceedings, but cannot get a message through. The commanding officer of the 1st Essex decides to stop the battle himself after 2 companies have gone over, and he can see that it is a pointless activity. At that stage, the fighting on this part of the battlefield stops, and all you are left with is a field of khaki and the sounds and the cries of the wounded and the desperate.
Trouble was, if they got wounded on the first day, there wasn't a lot we could do for them. They were trapped underneath heavy machine gun fire. Unless they could crawl back to our lines, we couldn't help them. They laid there basically for 4 months. Their bodies were still there when we took the ground 4 months later.
The losses the PALs suffer cast a pall over the small communities from where they were recruited. Over 50,000 men are killed or wounded on the first day.
Bear in mind that by the end of 1915, French losses equated to or even exceeded the British Empire losses for the entire war. Now, because the British Army had had a bad day, it could hardly throw up its hands and say, we're finished, we're not going to do any more. The preparations, of course, the enormous preparations for the massive assault on Somme had been made. You couldn't switch your attack somewhere else just like that. You really had no option but to continue to press it. I mean, you don't win a war by despairing when something goes wrong, when you have a bad day. And undoubtedly, the first day of the Somme turned out to be a very bad day. There was a narrow margin in places. And remember, it was also quite successful down south.
In the north, we're attacking uphill. Our artillery cannot see what they're hitting. In the south, the ground's completely different. There's a great big ridge just behind the British lines, behind Carnoy, from where the forward artillery observers can see what artillery is hitting, and they can adjust their fire accordingly. That's actually the real reason why it's so successful.
At Montauban, the British guns spend more time neutralising German artillery than any other sector on the front. Aided by the heavy artillery of the French 30 Corps and excellent observation of the German position, the British gunners obliterate the German front line.
The fighting at Montauban, once they actually got into the German trenches, was very heavy. There's a lot of hand-to-hand, that means a lot of bayonets, a lot of rifle butts. It's very, very brutal stuff. And there's not many prisoners taken, hardly any. One of the great problems with an attack like that there is not much of a facility for taking prisoners. Later on, in the attack on Thiepval on the 26th of September, the operational orders actually say, don't take any prisoners, because there is no facility for them. As the attack's rolling forward, there isn't the mechanism to take them back and deal with them. So they don't take any.
The French army attack 1 hour after the British. With more heavy guns, a shorter front and veteran troops, they make deep penetrations into the German front.
These are preserved French trenches on the French sector of the Somme, and from here they launch an attack on the 1st of July and they achieve all their objectives. The artillery was very accurate. They knocked out the German batteries, and the French soldier rushed the German position and capture very quick their objective.
Of the 600,000 Allied casualties at the end of the battle, 1/3 will be French. For the first time, an army will attempt to control the skies over a battlefield.
The Royal Flying Corps can bring artillery fire down onto resupplying troops, on reinforcements 3-4 miles behind the battlefield. Suddenly there's no place to hide. You will be seen and the artillery will land on you.
Artillery spotting was not the Royal Flying Corps' only task. They fly deep behind German lines.
Carrying out bombing raids on railway stations, destroying enemy kite balloons and observation posts, hitting troop trains and going behind the scenes trying to do as much damage as possible. Even if that meant in delicate aircraft like the BE-2s, it would mean big casualties. It would mean some amount of sacrifice.
Sir Douglas Haig does not see this sacrifice. He commands the battle from a chateau several miles to the rear of the fighting.
If you can imagine a brick wall that's 100 miles long, if you stand 3 feet away from it, how much of the brick wall can you see? But if you stand 50 miles back from it, you can see the whole thing. That's the principle. That if you get too close to it, you can control a tiny bit of it. He's got to control the whole lot. There's nothing to be gained. The whole thing cascades down all the way from the top. The people down here on the ground, they organise their bit. That keeps going all the way back to the guy who, Haig's job really is just to say, what I'd like, fellas, I would like you to capture this ground. Go and make it happen. Then divisional commanders, brigade commanders, battalion commanders, they are the people who actually make that happen. Haig doesn't write operational orders for infantry platoons.
Haig's only success is in the south. This is where he will continue his attack. The French opposed this plan, pointing out that once the fighting in the north stopped, the German reserve would be free to move to oppose him.
The French want us to get in there and fight. They want to see us up to our arms in blood. They don't want to kill Britons, particularly. What they want is for the British to kill Germans. That's what they want. And that's why they want to send the British into action where it counts.
But the German defences on Thiepval Ridge are still formidable, and the shattered bodies of the first day are mute testament to the suicidal nature of any assault there. Haig stands his ground, and men from Wales will fight for MAMETZ Wood.
Lloyd George, leading politician of the time, soon to become, after the Battle of the Somme, the British Prime Minister, comes up with an idea that there should be a Welsh corps, is what he originally plans to have. Recruiting doesn't quite come up to expectations, but they do form a division, and roughly speaking, a division is getting on for 20,000 men. To give them their formal title, these guys become the 38th Welsh Division. They are commanded by very much an amateur soldier. Lloyd George is a politician to his fingertips, and he decides that he will have one of his guys in charge, and put in charge of it is a fellow called Ivor Phillips, who was a political crony of Lloyd George's, if you like. He may have been a fine politician, but he was less a fine general, one might venture. Part of this phase, we're now a week on from the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. It's now the 7th of July, and the problem is there are a number of woods, a semicircular horseshoe of woods facing the British Army. It's decided these woods have to fall. The objective the Welsh are tasked with is to take MAMETZ Wood, and they actually go through in 2 attacks. Both, sadly, although they do actually lodge themselves into the wood in the second attack, both of these attacks are absolutely disastrous. It was a huge problem of the British Army per se during the Battle of the Somme, that you've got a relatively inexperienced attacking force attacking very well-trained, well-armed and determined defenders. And the Germans are in very strong positions. MAMETZ Wood is a highly well-fortified position. Wood fighting is terrible at the best of times, that when you've got a resolute foe in there, actually fighting your way through a wood is a very difficult task. On 3 sides, effectively, they have German defenders who just spray them liberally with lots of lead and steel, and the attack is nothing short of a failure. It does cost Phillips his command. One of the myths, I would venture, of the Great War, and it's a war that's surrounded by mythology, certainly as far as the British are concerned, is that no matter how bad a general is perceived to be, that they keep their jobs. Not true, and Phillips pays for this this debacle, really, with his command. He's actually sent back home.
Ivor Phillips is not the last politician to cause Hague problems. By the end of July, Winston Churchill, still under a cloud for his part in the Gallipoli disaster of 1915, begins to agitate for an end to the battle.
There was a group of politicians, which included Winston Churchill, led by Lloyd George, and of course they become much more influential once Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister at the end of 1916. They believed that the answer to winning the war was not to take on the Germans on the Western Front, but to knock away what they called the props. Now what they meant by the props was Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary and Turkey. And the idea was that if you knocked away the props, then Germany would collapse, failing to realise that actually it's Germany that's the prop. Austria-Hungary, Turkey and Bulgaria are kept in the war by German advisors, German money and German equipment. And in a funny way, if you knock them away, Germany in fact is strengthened because she doesn't have to dissipate her assets trying to prop up rather unreliable and not necessarily terribly efficient allies. The only way to win this war was to take on the main enemy, Germany, in the main theatre, the Western Front. There was no other way to do it, but of course politicians will always look for the easy way. And very often the easy way doesn't work.
On the 14th of July, the British launched an attack into the woods under the cover of darkness.
French were very sceptical, incidentally, about attacking, for example, at night. And when on the 14th of July, the two southern British corps launched a night attack, which was a significant success, the French were extremely surprised by that.
For 3 days, artillery pounds the woods. At 03:25, the infantry advances. A South African brigade is tasked with taking Delville Wood.
And it takes a hell of a lot of artillery to flatten a wood. A wood is a formidable position. When you actually shell a wood, it makes the problem worse because the trees don't go away. The trees actually fall over and become an almost impenetrable barrier. And another huge problem with wood fighting is your command and control. When the South Africans actually get in the wood, finding out where friend and foe is in a confused environment such as this is a huge problem. These guys are very keen to show what they can do. It's their first major taste of action on the Western Front, and such is their vim and vigour that their impetus carries them almost through the entire wood, all bar a little sliver down on the end over there. However, the Germans at this stage of the campaign are following the edict that if we lose any ground, we are to recapture it immediately. Indeed, the awful phrase that was used by one of the German generals in command of this action is the British, and we were all the British as far as the Germans were concerned, the British will advance only over German corpses. So any ground that the Germans lose, they will retake immediately.
The Germans saturate the wood with high explosive and poison gas.
It's not a war-winning weapon, and as long as you know about it, it's not going to kill you. As long as you've got your respirator on and you've got your various anti-gas protective kit on, you will survive. But it is exceedingly inconvenient. It's hot, you sweat up inside it, it's difficult to hear, it's difficult to make yourself heard. So gas is not a war-winning weapon, but it is certainly an embuggerance. Shelling is pretty bad anyway if you happen to be on the receiving end, but it's particularly nasty if you're in woods because a lot of the shells will go off in the canopy. So you not only have shell splinters flying about and shrapnel balls flying about if that's what they're using, you've also got bits of wood and splinters flying about. And a big splinter from an oak tree will go through you and kill you just as effectively as a piece of shrapnel will. It was said that at one stage there was something like 200 shells a minute going off in Delville Wood. You wouldn't even hear the individual shells. There would just be a terrific noise, a continuous noise.
The South Africans in this terrible situation are soon in big, big trouble. And over the course of the next 6 days, they are hammered back through the wood into more or less a little sliver, a little corner of it, where the visitor centre now stands. Now, in the height of the fighting, their brigade commander, he goes up the chain of command, words to the effect of, to his commander, "We're in big trouble here, get us the hell out of here." In his defence, the divisional commander says, "Very good, I understand your position, but I have no other troops with whom to replace you. You have your orders." And The orders are, as you know, hold until relieved. The men in this wood hold this wood for 6 days and 6 nights. You'll understand now why it's the place where the South African National Memorial is, why the wood is actually South African property. Roughly speaking, they come in here at full brigade strength. 3,000 men come into this wood. On the 6th day, when they are finally relieved, when they actually do a roll call a day or two later, I think it's about a dozen officers and 750 men are found to be still standing or accounted for. The whole wood is virtually a mass grave. 7 divisions in total fight through this wood. 4 Victoria Crosses are won, and it's finally subdued the end of August, the beginning of September. Delville Wood, it was given another and a very apt name by the troops who had the misfortune to find themselves here in 1916. They christened it, and boy did it live up to the name, Devil's Wood.
6 months after Irish Republicans rebel in Dublin, the 16th Division, composed of Irish nationalists equally committed to Irish independence and hoping their sacrifices in this war will bring that about, enter the bloody battle for Ginchy.
The 16th Irish Division were faced with a whole new set of problems. When the Germans mutated their defences, they were beginning to get a tinge more elastic in the way they faced. They wouldn't necessarily stay in one nice delineated straight line. They moved into no man's land. They moved back between the lines. They occupied the shell holes, put in machine gun teams where they could do the maximum damage. Now, that meant that the British barrage had to cover everything. They couldn't just pound the front lines. Now, the creeping barrage was doing that anyway, but it's all a sign of things that are moving forward. The Irish were faced with machine gun fire coming from just in front of them, a bit further back than that, to the side. Machine guns were moving out. They were catching them in the open, and the casualties were getting higher and higher.
The losses the Irish suffer in this sector of the Somme are a double tragedy. Among the fallen are many of the leading lights of the Irish independence movement. Their passing is the death of any hope for a peaceful solution to Ireland's troubles. Ginchy is a crushing blow to Britain's Prime Minister. His son, Lieutenant Raymond Asquith, dies in the ruined village. The German front line is a mere shadow of the defences that confronted the British on the 1st of July. Yet, under an increasingly intense bombardment, they cling on to their shattered trenches.
The Germans, they were fantastic. They were so determined to hold us back. That they were going to hold us back come what may. And what they did was basically they would sell their lives to give them time behind them to build the new lines, the new defence lines that they needed.
The original plan for a short battle to draw in the German reserves has now become a grinding battle of attrition. Haig's attention now moves back to Thiepval Ridge. The Australians are brought from the reserve to spearhead a new attack at Pozières. Pozières, like all the villages in the path of the advance, has been converted into a fortress. It will take 7 weeks of vicious fighting to capture the ruined village.
The battlefields in France are a tremendous basis upon which to understand the nature of the Australian psychic in many ways. Whilst we always look back to Gallipoli about what happened at Gallipoli and the forming of a nation, it's not until you come to the Western Front in France that you see just how tenacious and how persevering the Australian soldier was at that time. If you take the windmill, for example, where the Australian divisions that operated there over a period of some 7 weeks mounted 19 attacks in that period of 7 weeks and sustained 23,000 casualties.
Anyone who had fought at Gallipoli, they thought they'd seen it all. That was the big effort in 1915. They knew what war was all about, so they thought. When they got to the Western Front, that's where they met industrial warfare, continental warfare, millions of shells. They couldn't believe it.
The fighting in villages like Pozières is incredibly intense because every single house is fortified, every single cellar is fortified, and you're literally having to wheedle people out one at a time, lobbing bombs in cellars, fighting all the way through the cellars. A lot of the cellars have been joined up, tunnelled through from one to the other. It's a very, very messy business. I don't need to tell an Australian what the casualties were like in Pozières. The fighting was furious there. The piles of Australian dead stacked up around the windmill. It's some of the most intense fighting on the whole front.
The Australians advance across Thiepval Ridge. Unsupported on either flank, they are now exposed to fire from 3 sides. It is at a place called MCEWAN Farm that the Australian Army will suffer its greatest loss in World War I. On the other side of the wire, the German losses mount.
German policy under their commander Falkenhayn was not to give an inch of ground, and therefore any loss of so much as a trench, it had to be retaken. So the Germans counterattacked ceaselessly. In fact, I think it was John Terrain who worked out that the number of German attacks, counterattacks, at least equated to the number of British attacks on the Somme. And so they themselves were losing heavily in terms of trying to retake and recover ground that had been taken from the British. But of course, slowly, bit by bit, they got pushed back.
They're moving back on metalled roads to prepared positions and then bringing down their artillery fire onto our infantry in the same devastating way that they were doing back in the early months of the battle.
The savage battle for the woods leads to one of the most controversial periods of the conflict.
Haig definitely loses control of the battle in August and early September. It's not particularly his fault. It is such a complex undertaking, and the concepts of generalship at the time were very much to let the people underneath you do their job. You set the way forward and then let them get on with it. Now, Haig was forced to intervene because British generalship in August and September, early September, is appalling. How many times did they have to have it demonstrated to them that you can't attack on a narrow front or the Germans will pour fire in from the side? How many times do they have to be told that you have to have sufficient artillery support or you're going nowhere? How many times did they have to be told that you don't aim to go too deep in a single step at that stage of the war?
As the grinding battle of attrition continues, a new secret weapon makes its debut.
What I'm going to do now is take you around and show you the Mark IV tank. Reason is the Mark I is a complete rust bucket inside, there's nothing to see. But if we go to the Mark IV here, mechanically it's identical inside. So what I can show you in the way the engine and all that kind of stuff is exactly the same as the fellas in the Mark I had to operate. So if you'll come with me, we'll get inside the tank and have a look. Now, as you can see, it is not comfortable in here. I'm only 5'3" and I can't stand up straight. But let's first of all get our bearings while we're inside the tank. This object here is the most important bit of all. This is the engine. When this engine's running, the noise is so loud you won't hear anything else. In fact, I can tell you that your head will ring with that noise for about 2 days after you get out. It just gets embedded inside your head. So there's no use talking to anyone in here. If you want to talk, you get out. You'll probably get shot at the same time. If that isn't bad enough, there's the heat. Once the engine's running, these exhaust stacks will start glowing, literally glowing with the heat. And it'll get up to about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It's warm. There's no good opening all the flaps and hatches around here to let the heat out, because bullets will come in. And if that is not bad enough, the manifold, the exhaust manifold down here, will also leak. So the tank will fill with carbon monoxide, great clouds of it swirling about everywhere. They say that some men sitting in the tank could be given an order 3 or 4 times, hollered right in their ear, and they wouldn't react. Their minds had just gone numb from breathing in this stuff. So basically you're being gassed, you're being roasted, and you're being deafened all at the same time, and you're expected to work. And work they did. Of course, the secret was that they'd had this stuff drilled into them so much, they did it almost automatically. The tank's moving across country. It has no springs at all. It may surprise you. No British tank of the First World War had any springs at all. Whatever it went over, you felt it. Bumpity bump, through you, through the tank. Of the 8 men in here, the only 2 sitting down with the driver and commander, everybody else is clutching something, hanging on for grim death. And every now and again the tank will lurch, may pitch into a shell hole. It's no good the driver turning around to his mates and saying, "Look out." They won't hear him. Suddenly the tank will drop like a lift with a string broke, and you just grab for the nearest thing. And the nearest thing can be very, very hot indeed.
Of the tanks deployed, only 22 make it to the start line, where 7 break down before the attack.
The biggest weapon against the tanks, and always is and always will be, is artillery. And they brought down concentrations of artillery fire onto the British tanks. And they could not exist with it. And of course it also meant that troops couldn't go near them either. So the tanks weren't going, there weren't enough of them and they weren't good enough. They were a weapon for another year, and that year, to be honest, is 1918.
But they did what they were expected to do. They absorbed much of the incoming fire, only because the Germans saw these things and shot at them rather than the infantry. They trod down the wire, trod it down sufficiently that a man picking his way carefully could follow through, using the bulk of the tank as some sort of protection. They were also, at that time, something of a terror weapon, quite enough to make many people see them coming on against that fire, blanch, leave their trenches and get out the way quickly. But if you want a slightly different take on Haig, you should know Haig got in touch with the authorities in London and ordered 1,000 more tanks. This on the basis of a very mediocre debut performance.
The need for more tanks was clear to anyone looking at the battered but still formidable German line atop Thiepval Ridge. Haig's hopes for an offensive in Belgium are quickly fading as the Somme draws in more of his troops. The Canadian Corps, beginning to earn a reputation as an elite formation, enter the battle for Thiepval. The Canadians relieve the bloodied Australians at Mouquet Farm. With the British 18th Division, they assault the German line across ground strewn with the dead of 2 months' fighting. To take the village of Thiepval, now the site of the memorial to the missing, the British employ a risky tactic, a rolling barrage, a curtain of shells to shield the advance.
There's something between them and the enemy, and obviously the devastating effect of the shell fire is keeping the enemy's heads well down in their trenches, allowing our chaps to get as close as possible. The British troops are within yards rather than hundreds of yards of exploding shells, and a shell doesn't know what side you're on.
18th Division, in no time at all, get into Thiepval, get in right amongst the chateau and push up almost to the Schwaben Redoubt. On the 1st of July, the troops attack at 7:30 in the morning, and common sense, people say, is that, oh, you should attack in the dark so you can't be seen. But of course, if you can't be seen, you can't see where you're going. And even though there was a very successful attack on High Wood in the dark, by the 26th of September, they'd realised that actually, if you attack at 7:30 in the morning, by midday, by 2 in the afternoon, your troops are burnt out, they're worn out. At that point, you desperately need reserves, you need ammunition brought up, you need food brought up in broad daylight, where you're clearly being observed by the German artillery. And also it gives the Germans daylight to counterattack. So by the 26th of September, the decision then is to attack at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which may seem crazy, but actually what it means is that if you attack at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, by the time your troops are burnt out, it's dusk, night's starting to fall, and then overnight in the dark, you bring up the food, you bring up the ammunition, you bring up the reserves, you get plenty of opportunity to dig in and secure the area, and then the Germans have got no chance of counter-attacking till dawn, by which time you've had the whole of the hours of darkness to build a proper strong defensive position.
The victory at Thiepval is a turning point. The British now control the high ground, denied to them from the battle's beginning. However, it is in the south, in an attack forgotten by history, that the way to victory in 1918 is shown.
The Battle of Morville was the glimmer, a glimmer of hope for British tactics. It's where they're just getting that feel of the all-arms battle. You know, they're starting to get it right. Biting holes coming in, massed artillery, infantry moving forward with slightly more sophisticated tactics, the use of tanks, there are not many of them, but used in a complementary role. The aircraft above them, it's starting to work and not trying to go too far. That is the crucial thing. And the Battle of Morville was in many ways the first really positive sign of the all-arms battle.
The battlefield is now a toxic wasteland of body parts and chemicals from high explosive and gas, where even the rainwater and the shell holes can kill. To feed and arm his army, Haig must move 20,000 tons of supplies a day across this man-made nightmare. Rail lines are rapidly built, but these can only reach the rear of the British line. The rest of the journey is on men's backs.
The fastest way to get from A to B across country is on a horse. The internal combustion engine wasn't reliable. There were very few pneumatic tyres here. Most vehicles have got solid rubber tyres. That means they've got no cross-country capability. So until they have got a cross-country capability, you're down to the horse. There's no other way of getting quickly from A to B. The horse is the Land Rover of today, if you like. And that's why we have so many of them. Now, it's absolutely true that 25% of all the shipping from the UK consisted of horse fodder. But this was not for the so-called pampered cavalry. Some of it was. Most of it was for the horses that pulled the administrative wagon, the cookhouse wagons, the ambulances. All the logistic trail was all horse-drawn. There was nothing else to draw it. Every 18-pounder field gun was pulled by 6 horses. There was no other way of moving it.
For the infantry, life and death would go on in the trenches.
Here within the grounds of Chetwell Memorial, you can still see the shell holes that haven't been covered up or farmed over from the years after the First World War. They basically had to create new trench systems as they went. The quickest and safest way to do this was to link up from shell hole to shell hole, because half the work had already been done for them.
No battalion spends more than 10 days a month in the trenches. No individual soldier spends more than 4 days a month in the firing line. The reason is that they are constantly rotated. Now, the French didn't do this, and the Germans didn't do it to the same extent. What the British do is they constantly rotate people. Now, the great thing about that is that it is wet, it is cold, you're being shelled, you haven't had any breakfast because the communication trench has collapsed, and it's Tuesday, but you know that by Thursday you'll be at a billet behind the lines, hot shower, clean uniform, game of football, plate of fish and chips, and a pint of beer. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that is one of the reasons why the British Army is the one army amongst the major players that doesn't have a major breakdown of morale. This constant rotation. French thought we were mad, spending all that effort moving people up and down and up and down and up and down. But it was a major factor in maintaining morale. People knew they were only there for a limited period. If you're in the French Army, you could be up there for 18 months. You cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's one of the reasons why the French Army collapses in 1917.
Once the Germans were forced out of their initially very well prepared positions, they were defending from shell holes. That's made them vulnerable again to aerial observation, to shrapnel fire, and when high explosive was involved, to the risk of being buried alive. Shrieking for help, people digging frenziedly with spades to try and get them out, and then finding a hand. And they follow the hand up, hoping that there was a shoulder still attached to it, and gradually get round to the face and clear all this muck and mud out of their nose and mouth and apply artificial respiration. And if they were lucky, they survived. The trouble was the weight of mud on the lungs very often ruptured them, and the men, if they didn't die from the shock of the actual shell, died subsequently from being crushed.
It's said that at the time, the life expectancy of the average pilot in the Royal Flying Corps during the Battle of the Somme was somewhere in the region of 7 days. Conditions were freezing because most of your body would be standing outside the cockpit. The gunner, the observer, would stand in the front to fire his machine gun, faced by the icy blast of wind. Castor oil, which is the main lubricant for the rotary engines of the time, would spit out during the flight, and the aircrew behind the slipstream from the propeller would ingest the castor oil. Castor oil, of course, is a laxative.
September is a bad month for the Germans. Down at Verdun, it's not working. Falkenhayn has promised the Kaiser that he can bleed the French army white, and he clearly isn't. He's now taking more casualties than he's inflicting. And he, of course, ultimately is sacked and sent off to the Romanian front. At home in Germany, the Royal Naval blockade is beginning to bite. Rations are getting short. The German army is having a problem with manpower. They're now having to conscript everyone above the age of 16. Ludendorff, who takes over as effectively the chief of staff of the army, says the German army cannot withstand another Somme. Things are not good in Germany.
with October comes the rain, and it comes in a plenty. The ground here turns readily to mud. And arguably this is the most vicious part of the Somme fighting, because the conditions that the poor men fighting here are just truly, truly awful. Very difficult to build trenches, they fill with water very quickly, very difficult to make an attack. You can't get your guns forward to support the troops properly. The Germans are well up high on the ridge, aren't they always? 2 new sets of defensive ridges before Bapaume. Realistically, all hope of a breakthrough has gone here. Very, very heavy casualties, troops desperately tired. They would flog their way through the morass. Having reached the positions, if they were lucky enough to reach them, they would have to use anything at hand to actually build up their defences. Often, sadly, that was the dead bodies of their comrades. This really was the lowest point of the Battle of the Somme.
But the ground wasn't really important. The Somme is not a strategic area. What was important ultimately was that the German army, in fact, under, as Ludendorff himself said, German army was bled on the Somme and was never the same again. The NCOs, the peacetime NCOs in particular, and officers, the losses the Germans suffered, they never really recovered from.
If success came here, you could measure it in tens of yards, and the cost was truly horrendous. A pertinent question might be to ask, well, what the hell are we doing up here?
Haig believed that the German army was approaching defeat, that they battered forward, that they just couldn't sustain this level of effort. Remember, they're fighting the French at Verdun as well. Haig genuinely believed that at any moment the Germans would collapse. But they wouldn't. This is continental warfare. This is nation states at arms. This is where you can bring up a division in no time by railways. Not just one division, a corps, a new army. You have to kill millions of your enemy to win. And in this case, that meant millions of Germans. It's not easy because they don't want to be killed, and they'll kill millions of you in trying to do it. This is the horrible nature of the First World War. There's no easy way out. Don't get into the war in the first place is the way to get out.
The weather was absolutely bloody. Sleet, snow, freezing conditions, wind. Everybody's rifles were choked with mud. Everything was rusting, and they were absolutely frozen. They've been there in the trenches so long, in these muddy linked shell holes, that their clothes and the leather equipment and the boots they were wearing were starting to rot on them.
The condition of captured Germans reveals the state of their army. As winter closes in, Haig will launch his final offensive.
This was the last gasp battle of the Somme proper. It launched on the 13th of November, and here we have the 51st Highland Division, a territorial unit, sometimes known as Harper's Duds, from their divisional sign, HD. They attacked from a slightly different angle from the 1st of July, and they had the advantage that by this stage the British advance to the south meant that the artillery could fire support in enfilade. The attack was launched at dawn, it was launched in fog, German visibility therefore was practically nil, and it was extremely successful. So the contrast between the 1st of July and the 13th of November is considerable, but we have to take into account the weather, the state of the Germans opposite, who have been pulverised for months.
The Germans have few reserves left, with no replacements. Shelling and sniping are slowly destroying their army. To add to the misery, dysentery breaks out.
At Beaumont-Hamel, Infantry Regiment 62 had been in the line for several days before the final attack on the 13th of November. The companies were down to 1/3 strength. They'd begun the battle at 250. They were down to about 80. They were losing men to shelling, and they were all ill. By the time the attack eventually came in, they were really in a bad way to try and resist it.
Haig and the other British generals are remembered as butchers and bunglers.
This incredible organisation, the British Army, in 1914-18 war, is the largest single organisation in the entire history of the British nation. It was awesome. The equivalent of taking the population of 3 medium-sized cities bringing them to Europe, feeding them, watering them, arming them, clothing them, looking after their medical requirements, looking after their teeth, looking after their post. It was phenomenal. It was absolutely awesome. You know, these people were not donkeys. These were an incredibly successful organisation. Of course, they made a lot of mistakes on the way. Nobody had ever experienced warfare like this, but the important thing, the British Army learned every single step of the way. By 1918, there's no regular soldiers left. There's hardly any volunteers left. In 1918, 18-and-a-half-year-old conscripts, incredibly well trained and incredibly well led, defeated the German army in the field.
There's no question that as the war goes on, Haig is being treated by his own government in a way that no commander-in-chief in the middle of a war ought to be treated. He is having tremendous problems with Lloyd George particularly, and his satraps such as Churchill, who don't see the point of fighting in the Western Front anyway. He has the politicians making speeches in the House of Commons which are frankly lies, denigrating the army, denigrating Haig. The only reason Lloyd George didn't sack Haig was that he couldn't find anyone capable of taking over from him or who was prepared to take over from him.
The German losses overall came to about the same as the French and British losses, somewhere around about 600 to 650,000. So in terms of a battle of attrition, you could say it was an even balance, except the Germans could less afford to lose those numbers. From the British Army's point of view, though, the Somme was really the defining point in which they really learnt how to fight large-scale warfare on an industrial scale. The beginning of the Battle of Somme, the British Army was a very inexperienced force by and large, and particularly in things like its artillery. The huge expansion over the previous 2 years had resulted in a force that really needed to develop its systems, and really the only way to develop your systems in battle is in battle. In the course of the Somme, the British developed that, and ultimately, of course, the Somme was where the British Army learnt its trade and led to the more successful events, the offensives of 1917 primarily, but in particular 1918, when the British Army by then had developed an all-arms battle system that was probably superior to anything else on the continent.